I'm not quite sure what Michael was going to say, but just to say that this is a collaboration between the British Society for Animal Science, the British Grasslands Society, and the Committee of the Stapleton Trust. And we thought it would be a good idea to have a couple of webinars during this time of lockdown. And having consulted around a bit, it seemed that a very key topic at this point was locking in carbon with grasslands. This is a two-part series. So this webinar today is on the science side. Then in a week's time, on the 2nd of July, I will be convening the second one in the series, which is about policy. And the speakers for that one, I think, are now on the web. So we wanted to do it that way because we wanted to have the science, but we also, for the science actually to have an impact, then it has to feed through into the policy. So we wanted to make sure that we had the two aspects being considered here. And it's very pertinent that this is webinar is today when UKCCC has just published its report. Okay, so Michael has just rejoined, but yeah, please do indeed chair the Q&A, Michael, because this is not, I'm certainly not a soil scientist. While I know a bit about carbon in soil, I'd be much happier if Michael was chairing that part of it. Okay, so at least we can see him. Although if you want to take over now, Mike. Cool.
Yes, thank you, Maggie, and I apologise for that. And if I drop out again, we have a fantastic replacement, much better than I, so thank you very much, Maggie. As Maggie says, we're excited to be able to present this on behalf of the British Society of Animal Science, Global, also the British Grassland Society and the Stapleton Memorial Trust, as it's a real pertinent, vital area to start thinking about the potentials of different facets of agriculture to harvest and capture carbon and convert it into food, which is the most important part of agriculture, of course. And Grasslands has a major role to play in that. So we've gathered together three excellent speakers today to talk around the science of carbon within a grassland, starting from the soil, then to the pasture itself, and also other aspects that we often see on the vast majority of pasture.
He's gone again, isn't
he? He has. And this was happening to me last week, so I have a huge amount of sympathy for that. Okay, so I think without further ado, we should move on to our first speaker, Andy Neal. And maybe Andy, there was a bio, but just very briefly introduce yourself. That would be great. And over to you. And I will certainly be keeping an eye on the time.
Right. Thank you very much, Maggie. And also thank you to everyone who's turned up this evening to come and listen to me talk about some very dry soil science. Actually, I'll try and make it as lively as possible to make up for the weather outside. So my name's Andy Neal. I'm actually a soil microbiologist. So my main interest is actually in the living carbon in soil. But what I want to talk to you about today is work that's really resulted from the last 2 years of our research that looks at the relationship between microbes and soil organic carbon. And I guess the real message I want to get across is that soil organic carbon is so much more than just locking carbon away for atmospheric purposes. There's all sorts of other benefits that I hope to touch on as we go through to getting soil and keeping soil carbon in soil. So I'll get underway, and the title of my talk is what has soil carbon ever done for us? And some of you out there will be old enough to realize what's going on in this picture. This is my motley collection of research.
You're not actually sharing your screen?
Am I not? Oh, that's not very good, is it? Right, let's start again. There you go. Now can you see it?
Yes, that's fine, thanks.
There you go.
I think.
What has soil carbon ever done for us? I'll start again. So as I said, some of you will recognize the discussion that's going on in this picture. And what I really wanted to identify is that soil carbon is doing an awful lot more for us than we usually hear about in the media or think about when we think of soil carbon. As I say, this is really work that's come out of the last 2 years of our research program. And what has become more apparent over that time is that although we often think of soil as a thing, it's becoming increasingly apparent that soil is actually a process. It's a process of a lot of interrelated reactions and interdependencies going on at the same time. It's just so slow, we don't often notice that it's changing. But it changing at such slow rates, whoops, I'm going the wrong way now. It changes at such slow rates that we really don't understand or can appreciate what's going on. In the bottom left-hand corner of this screen here, we've got some data, long-term data from Rothamsted data sets showing that the rate of accumulation of carbon in soil, and this is a nice clay loam that should accumulate a lot of carbon. You can see that it really takes decades, perhaps even a century to really get to maximum levels that are able to be stored in soil. So when you're thinking of storing and trapping and maintaining carbon in soil, you've got to think about it as a real long-term endeavor rather than a short-term win. But the wins really are quite significant. On the right here, I just wanted to make the point that soil texture is also very important for determining the amount of carbon that we can trap and store in soil. At the bottom there, we've got 2 very long-term data sets again of carbon being stored in sandy loam, either as an arable or as a grassland management. And you can see that both of them, even the grassland, which should be storing good amounts of carbon as far as that soil is concerned, never reaches over that 60-year period the amount of carbon that is trapped in the clay loam arable. Even though that's slowly declining, all the efforts to maintain carbon in the sandy loam never really approach the amount of carbon that's stored in the clay loam. So these processes to do with soil texture and soil carbon metabolism really have a long-standing effect on how the rate at which carbon can be stored in soil. And I think that's something that is often missed from debates about how we can get to zero carbon and how rapidly we can ameliorate some of the climate issues to do with carbon in the atmosphere. So it's worth bearing in mind as we go through that these processes I'm talking about are very slow and long-term processes. Now, to get you, they were very large-scale issues. To get you down in the frame of mind of thinking about the sort of scales that I think of, I want to show you this video. I hope you can see it. What it is, it's generated from an X-ray computed tomography scan of a soil aggregate. This soil aggregate is about 2 millimeters in size. And what we're doing is we're flying through the pore network in that soil aggregate. Now, the pores in here are the largest ones, about 100 microns in size. So that's about a micron is 1,000th of a millimeter. So we're talking very small scales. I'm showing you these because we know that these dimensions of pores are very important for storing water in soil. So when a soil drains after a rain event, the water that's trapped and held back against gravity is held in these very small pores. It's also where we find most of the soil carbon in soil. Again, it's mostly trapped in these scales of pores. And this is also the scale that microbes operate at. So microbes are typically 1 to perhaps up to 100 microns in size if you think about a fungus. So these are the scales that we are thinking about in this talk and the scales that are important for the processes that I want to show you in the rest of the talk. I hope some of you have caught that. So on the left here, as I've just said, we're using computed tomography to, whoops, gone too far, computed tomography to visualize the pore networks. And what we're seeing here is what we call the pore skeleton. So it's the connectivity of pores in these soils. We have three different types of soils here. The bottom one here is soil that has been effectively purposefully degraded by not growing any plants in it for 50 years. So it's tilled very regularly, 3 or 4 times a year. And as you can see, as you go up through a typical arable soil, which is there, to a grassland soil at the top, the number of pores and also the connectivity of the pores increases as you go from the degraded soil through arable to the grassland soil at the top. And we can use these images to measure the connectivity of pores and also combine this with estimates of the carbon in those soils. And you'll see the red line in this central figure shows there's a very strong non-linear relationship between the amount of carbon in the soil and the amount of connected porosity that generates in the soil. And on the right here, we can use this data to model the hydraulic conductivity. So that's about how water and oxygen moves through this pore network. And you can see that a poorly connected soil that has very low carbon inputs is able to move water and oxygen around very slowly. But the more carbon you put in there, the more rapidly you can move that carbon and water around, that nutrients, oxygen and water around, I should say. So what are the consequences of that for soil behavior? Well, if we think about this connected porosity hydraulic conductivity data, as you move to the top right of the corner of that figure, you're increasing not only your capacity to store water because of a greater connectivity of pore space, but you're also increasing the capacity to move water, nutrients, and oxygen around to the biological entities in soil. And this is very important. On the right there, we've used more modeling to predict the anoxic proportions of pore space in those soils, going from dry soil on the right to wet soil on the left. And the bare fallow soil, which is the one that's had no carbon inputs for 50 years, you'll notice is actually 100% anoxic at just below field capacity. That's that theta FC. So very poorly connected soil that contains very little carbon is very poor at moving oxygen around and has a lot of anoxic space, even when it's looking in a relatively dry situation. When you compare that to arable, but more importantly to grasslands, you can see that the anoxic proportion of pore space across the range of matrix potential that we're looking at here is significantly lower in grassland soils. So grassland is very good in a number of ways, not only because it stores a lot of carbon, but because it holds a lot of water, and also it minimizes the amount of anoxic space in the soil. Now, why is that important? Well, that's important, and I should say, the weather's too good for me to spend a lot of time on this. I'd love to tell you all about the information here, but I just want to say that we now have the technology to be able to understand the abundance of different genes that are driving important processes in soil. So anaerobic processes that are driving off methane and driving off nitrous oxide and hydrogen sulfide from the soils. And the connectivity of the soil, which allows oxygen and water to move through the system, which is related to the amount of carbon in the soil, has a really strong effect on controlling the abundance and the expression of these genes. So we've now gone from just having carbon in soil to actually seeing that this manipulates and controls the expression of some of the very negative impacts that soil and agricultural practices has on emissions. And grassland, you'll be pleased to hear, is actually minimizing a lot of those negative processes. So I just want to end really and sort of summarize that. This work over the last 2 years has started to help us see soil as actually a product of genes. So when you hold soil in your hand you're not holding an inanimate physical object. You're holding a complex biological process, which is driven by the carbon that you put in. The more carbon you put in, and let's see if I can, whoops, just highlight this for you. The more carbon you put in, you can drive the abundance of genes into a good state where a lot of the nutrients that you add to soil are already present in soil, are assimilated and stored in soil rather than being lost. And you reduce the amount of gaseous emissions from soil, such as methane and nitrous oxide. If you come down to the very poorly degraded soil, and a lot of arable soils are like this. In fact, the arable soils we looked at in this experiment weren't that much different from soil that had been completely starved of carbon for 50 years. So arable is not necessarily a particularly good way of managing soils. That process drives increase in the dissimilation of nutrients and the reduction of the assimilation of those nutrients into biomass. So they're very leaky systems, and the efficiency in which the nutrients are used is much reduced in arable and bare fallow systems than it is in grass. And Maggie has popped up to tell me I finished, right? Just as well, because I'd run out of things to say if that ever happens. I can't hear you.
Sorry, thanks very much indeed, Andy, and it's a very clear presentation. And I should have said at the start, if anyone has questions, please put them into chat, and I will read them out under my control when we move on. So we have a couple of questions here for you, Andy. First, is this porosity why biochar works in soil and biogas?
So at the moment, we're trying to understand what type of carbon really contributes to this pore structure. We think it's probably not biochar, but labile carbon that acts as a very good source of food and energy for microbes. We know that the more active the microbes are, the more porosity it develops. So we think it's probably not biochar. Biochar stores carbon in the sense of putting inert carbon in the soil, but we probably don't get much structure developed from it because it's in inertness. It's not used as microbe food.
Okay, thanks for that. And then the second one from Edward Bardsley. Would a more diverse sward feed a greater diversity of microorganisms and speed up carbon sequestration?
That's a very good question. I guess we're at the very early stages of sort of this new understanding of soil. Questions like that are ones that we very much hope to be answering soon. And like I say, that the real issue we're faced is we don't know yet whether it's the quality of carbon or the quantity of carbon that really promotes these processes. So your question is really saying, you know, the quality of carbon, the greater diversity of quality may be good. And I would tend to agree with that. I haven't got any evidence to support it.
Great, thanks. And thanks for keeping your answers short. And just, there's a couple more questions there. One we'll come back to at the end from Sajid, but one was asking for a repeat from Andrew. Where do micropores come from?
Good, that's a very good question. Our current understanding is that micropores are produced as a result of clay and soil colloids being stuck together by carbon that has been metabolized by microorganisms. So that is one reason why you don't get a strong porosity in sandy loam soils. And it also is important for it also describes why the more carbon you put into soil, the more structure you generate. Because we know that almost all the carbon that ends up in those very small scale pores has been through or has been part of a microorganism. So the microorganisms are very much at the center of creating this structure. They just need the carbon as a source of food, energy, and effectively glue.
Great, thanks very much, Andy. So
have I stopped sharing my screen?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I was trying to, which is why.
That's
right,
fine.
there we
okay.
are.
So we're moving on now to the second talk. Hopefully there'll be more time for questions at the end. And the second talk is from Katja. And Katja is from the Department of Forest, Grassland and Freshwater Ecology at INRA, based at Clermont-Ferrand in France. And Katja is going to talk to us about pasture composition management and how that she's got a special expertise in carbon and nitrogen cycling. So over to Katja.
Thank you. I think you have cut my video, or somebody did.
Not me.
Okay, I try to present. This one. Okay.
There we are.
Can you see?
Yes, we can see. We can't see you, but we can certainly see your screen.
Okay. And now
now we can see you and the screen.
Okay. And I am in the presenter mode or in the slide mode?
Just in the slide mode at the moment.
I try. Okay. It's very long. Better now? No.
No, it's still in the slide mode.
I think I have to do with that because when I press the button, nothing happens.
Okay.
Can you see, is the resolution well enough?
It's okay for me.
Ah, okay. Very good. Seems to work now.
Oh, okay, but we can see your notes, what's coming next. But
yes, this is what I asked earlier, how to remove that. Is it better now?
Yep, yep,
okay,
that's fine.
Okay,
good, excellent.
Okay, sorry for that. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Maggie. I think you said everything where I'm from. So I'm from France. I work on grassland ecology. So today I'd like to give you some overviews on the potential of grasslands to capture carbon. So the idea was to show you how does pasture composition and grazing management contribute to the herbage growth, and then the subsequent carbon returns to the soil and the carbon sequestration. So what I have to say here first, what is very important is that carbon sequestration actually is an active process. I think most of you know that, but I still like to repeat it. So there is first a photosynthesis, so the vegetation cover is really important. Then the vegetation becomes senescent first builds up and then becomes senescent over time. And this senescent material, this could be leaves, litter, roots, are incorporated into the soil and are decomposed, which was nicely shown just in the talk before. And then this contributes to the carbon sequestration. So now I can show you some of the principles of biomass production. So as I said, the biomass or the vegetation is very important. So you probably know all that if you work on grasslands, but we need leaves to grow to build up biomass, to build up organic matter, which enters the soil. So the growing leaves, so they receive carbohydrates to build up roots and groans, and then they form small leaves, which are usually very short-lived. And then within the middle age, they produce more and more energy that they can export to other plant parts. And then they become senescent, as I showed just before. Here you have a cycle just on below on the left side. What happens if there is grazing? So the plant grows. Usually there is the 3-leaf stage. Then animals arrive, they graze, and there are some leaves dying, and there is also some below ground part. Having that on a time scale, this is the right figure. You can see there is the net accumulation of biomass in blue, and then there's also the senescent and respiration here. And this all contributes to the carbon sequestration. If we now go, what is more important for the animals, because it's not the carbon sequestration where the animals live on, it's rather the forage quality. So if you have a very diverse sward, the quality can be the same of different grassland species. But what might not be different is the stage of maturity, because some of them will be on early stages and some on late stages. So depending on the harvest, the amount and the quality of your grassland will be different. But what counts for the carbon sequestration would be the green versus the senescent part. which change here over time, which you can see on the right-hand side. So you have the leaf yield, the forage quality, which declines over time because the sward becomes older. Then you have more and more stems because the plants grow higher, and then the forage quality also declines over time. So what happens if you use too intense your vegetation? Means the plant has not enough energy to grow on a leaf. So this happens when there is more than half of the leaf surface removed. So then the plant can't regrow. So this happens when you have very intense grazing or frequent cuts. So it is really critical to maintain a sufficient leaf biomass by a proper management. If you have sufficient leaves, the plant can invest into the root system. And if you have not sufficient leaves, so which means you remove more than 80% of the leaf biomass, there is no investment in roots anymore. And so there is no carbon input through the root system. The carbon input through the root system is very important because this is what showed Envy just before, gets decomposed in the different fractions and contributes to carbon sequestration and namely to the stability of carbon in the soil. Here in the figure, you can see if you remove more than 60 to 80% of the leaf material, your percentage of roots become very small. So actually, carbon sequestration and management is really closely linked. So management, meaning either continuous or rotational grazing, the duration and the frequency of the grazing, also the rest periods, and the density or the animal type of the grazing ruminants affects all these parameters, which go into carbon sequestration. So which makes it really difficult to have a proper grazing management plan or grassland management plan. Just show you just a small example. So this is a meta-analysis which was carried out by Zhu et al. In 2017, where he tested high, low, and medium grazing intensity. And there you can see where these intensities all interfere in microbes, in soil, roots, and so on. And then there is the carbon cycle, and then there is the nitrogen cycle, and they both are closely linked together. I'd like to go now a bit more into detail. So as said already by Andy, which was quite nice, so there is the soil carbon stock. So what is there since a long time, there's climate and soil type, and then there's management on top of that, contributing to the carbon sequestration. As you also said, depending on your initial soil carbon stock, it's like if you have either a small bus where there is a lot of space where you can still put more carbon in, this would be here, number one. Or you have a big bus, which is almost empty, or the other way around, where you can't put much further carbon in. So the carbon sequestration will be really small, which has nothing to do with the management, but with the initial soil carbon stock, which is together with the soil texture and the climate. Now we come to the grassland management. I'd just like to show you some papers. So in the earlier paper from Conan and all in 2001, he said that grazing management has rather a positive effect on carbon sequestration of grasslands. While a couple of years later, together with the 4 per Mill initiative, there have been a number of meta-analyses showing that grazing and grassland management itself have rather negative effects on carbon sequestration, which was really, in my opinion, was not a good message for the farmers, because I think grasslands are really important to store carbon in the soil. Within a French national abatement study, we went again through the literature, and then we did a really thorough literature research, and these are some results of this synthesis. So what we found out, if you take all countries together and all papers dealing with carbon sequestration of grasslands, you find that grasslands can store, let's say, 0.3 tons per hectare. If you go only on Europe, it's a little bit smaller, but you can see the standard error is quite high. So on average, grasslands may store between either being neutral or more than 1 ton of carbon. So how it comes that we have these differences? If we separate the data set into permanent grasslands, meaning old grasslands and young grasslands, which are shown, you can see statistically they're probably not very different. But if we separate them in mowing and grazing, you see that there is quite a difference. For the young grasslands, the mowing seems to reduce carbon sequestration, while the grazing seems to be a management which can improve the carbon sequestration. Also the fertilization. So on the left hand, you can see the increase in fertilizer amount and the increase in carbon sequestration. From that data, you may draw on the right hand the amount of fertilizer you would need to store carbon, which is from our data set, almost 4 kilograms of carbon are needed to sequester 1 kilogram of carbon, which is not the same number than which was found by Pueblo et al. In 2015. If we now come to what is better, continuous or rational grazing, as you remember, there are quite a huge number of different grazing types if you go to the paper of Allen et al. And you can't really say that continuous grazing is doing better than over rotational grazing. It really depends how your vegetation cover is, where you are, and where your climate is. From our data set, we could find no difference if there was no fertilization or very low fertilization. However, in very intense grasslands, which would be the red one, you can find a difference between the two grazing regimes, which explains the different data sets we can find in the literature. If we now come how much biomass you can use, as I said, some of the rules might be the 3-leaf rule. So it means how much carbon is exported by yield or by mowing or by grazing, so which is here on this axis. So the blue would be unfertilized and the red would be fertilized. You can see, you might draw a line, which is this one, that there is an optimum, but you can remove the same for the fertilized, an optimum beyond which, if you remove too much biomass, you can't store carbon anymore. As it is really difficult to draw a clear line to say, if you go over 5 tons of dry matter per hectare, you can't store carbon anymore. You have to consider what is the possibility of biomass production at your site. So this is called an herbage index, so which is the ratio between herbage use, so how much you remove, and how much is produced on your site depending on the climate, the vegetation, and the soil. And here again now, it looks much nicer. So you have the grazing in blue, the mowing in red. It seems that you can draw actually a line or curve where you have an optimum, and beyond this optimum, you decline carbon sequestration. While if you are in this earlier phases, you can improve carbon sequestration when you use more biomass. So now I come to the summary. So what is very important is that you should preserve grassland sites or grasslands at all, as you lose a lot of carbon whenever you till the soil. The second point is, from our data set, we could found, let's say, 0.2 tons of carbon per year can be stored in grassland soils. And as I said, this depends on the climate, soil type, and the age of the grassland and the applied managements. There is definitely a trade-off between carbon sequestration and the herbage use. From the data set we had, we could draw some simple rules saying if you are in the grazing, which would be blue, and you have either a low input system or a high nitrogen input system, if you use more than half of the biomass available, you will reach the threshold. And I just give you a small other example because my time is left. If you are in the mowing system and you, for example, have a fertilized field, your threshold seems to be, if you remove 80% of your biomass, you will decline carbon sequestration over time.
Grasslands Society
If you want to look up some of the numbers or some of the helps, I just show you here. There was a very nice paper or a very nice management plan from the European group, and there's also the report of the national study in France. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much indeed, Katja. And people are asking comments. Is it possible to get the slides afterwards? Yes, indeed. A recording will be available and the slides, and indeed Katja is showing she has extra slides there that show various things.
The clippings or not?
Okay, so there were some questions. So Paul,
Yeah.
you had a question. Let me just ask it for you so that we're fair to everybody. So Paul's question was, does the mowing on young grassland mean that the forage is removed, and how would it differ if it was mowed and left in place?
Yes, the mowing means in our case is that the biomass was removed for hay or for silage. I know there are some mowing events where you leave the biomass on the ground. I think this is very, let's say, very or better, but then it's not used for animals, because then the biomass or the dead material is incorporated in the soil and can contribute to the carbon sequestration.
Thank you. And there was another question here from Sajiv. Does carbon sequestration from grazing also assume manure is a part of the system?
Yes, not organic fertilization. So there are actually animal dejections, because actually there's a whole cycle. So the animals eat, and then about 60 to 80% of what they ingest returns to the site, which contributes to the carbon cycle and to the nitrogen cycle. So this is why at the beginning, at low grazing intensities, actually grazing animals contribute to the carbon sequestration as they recycle nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and carbon.
Great, thanks very much. I'm actually going to move us on. There are quite a few questions in chat. So Katja, if you'd like to look at those ones in chat and respond to them, and potentially also you can actually save chat onto your own computer. So perhaps you could do that at the end and maybe respond to them otherwise. So thanks Katja. We're now moving on to Helen Sheridan. And Helen is Assistant Professor in the School of Agriculture and Food Science in University College Dublin. Her research focuses on farmland habitats and management. And over to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Maggie. I'll just try and share my screen here. Sorry. Seem to have locked.
Okay, perhaps we can have some technical help. Just to say, messages or questions still coming in.
What are you getting, Helen?
I'm just seeing Maggie on my desktop, her picture. I'm not seeing my own file to share.
So did you click the green?
So I did, yeah.
Share screen.
Hold on.
There we go.
Oh, there we are. Excellent. Well done.
There we go. Sorry about that.
If you go into slideshow.
Yeah, I'm just gonna try that. Sorry. I just can't seem to get down as far as it. There we go. Now.
There you go.
Perfect.
Okay.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good evening from Dublin. This evening, I want to talk a little bit about the potential of on-farm woodlands to help with locking in carbon into our pastoral systems. I suppose in terms of the farm scale challenge, I just wanted to outline where we're at with that. Teagasc just this week published their new sustainability report, and we can see from this the levels of, or the average estimated levels of CO2 equivalents produced per hectare over the three main ruminant production system types here in Ireland. So there is a body of work to be done to try and offset that. This is a picture that I took recently in the Wicklow Mountains, and I guess it could reflect many places in Ireland, but equally parts of the UK as well. And I guess what strikes me most when I see this is the intimate relationship between farmland woodlands, hedgerows, tree lines, shrub, etc., with our pastoral systems. And I guess what we need to start doing is recognising the role that they are playing in terms of storing and sequestering carbon. We do know that they play a very important role in many other ecosystem services in terms of their delivery, but we've been slower at actually putting figures, I guess, on their carbon sequestration and storage potential. I suppose when I look at this, we do know that fast-growing conifer plantation forestry can sequester a lot of carbon very quickly, particularly species like Sitka spruce. So I suppose the question is then, and the challenge we grapple with is, should we be putting areas of our grassland under that to try and meet the challenge of keeping global temperatures down to 1.5 degrees? And I suppose I have quite strong opinions on that. I do recognise that we will need to see potentially some expansion of the existing forest base, all right. But there are just some reasons, there's a very long list of reasons that I can think of why we shouldn't overexpand on that. And I suppose the main one is, coming from a School of Agriculture, my primary interest is agricultural production. And we lose the capacity to produce agricultural products if we expand that forest base too much. There's really a trade-off there. It's a permanent decision. You're locking up that land for a very long time if you make that decision. And I would also have concerns about the potential loss of what we call high nature value farmland as a consequence of that. This is the image of a predicted distribution map of high nature value farmland in the Republic of Ireland. And the green areas are the areas that are more likely to have semi-natural habitats and high nature value farmlands. If we think about this discussion or this trade-off between forestry versus pastoral systems, you know, there are those who would look particularly at our dry stock systems and think, well, why not just expand our forestry to a much greater extent, because those dry stock farmers aren't really making a lot of money in a lot of instances. And I suppose where I'm seeing the green and yellow on this map largely coincides with where our dry stock production systems would be based here in Ireland. But I do want to, I suppose, make the point that we are facing both the climate and the biodiversity crisis. So therefore, we can't just solve one problem by exacerbating another. We're going to have to find ways of working with farmland woodlands as well as forestry, but the farmland woodlands to appreciate their level of carbon sequestration and storage and to improve on that. Just to illustrate what I mean in terms of my concern about switching to high growth Sitka spruce plantation, you can see one there on the right hand side of the screen versus a birch woodland on the left hand side, and the impact on biodiversity is very substantial, and there are other impacts as well. So if we're to think about farmland woodlands specifically, then I suppose the first thing that comes into our heads are our hedgerow network. Ireland and the UK are very fortunate to have a very extensive hedgerow network here. And if we look at the data around that, I've spent quite a bit of time mapping those hedgerows around the country. But if we look at their carbon store potential, Axe et al. In 2017 looked at the above ground carbon store from these and estimated that it was between about 32 and 40 tonnes of carbon per hectare, depending on the management that those hedgerows were undergoing in terms of flailing and the regularity of that, for example. But interestingly, the below ground carbon store was almost as big, or if not bigger in places. And I think that's something we often overlook. In terms of their sequestration potential on an annual basis, some work that was done here in Ireland on hedgerows and other non-forest woodlands using LiDAR indicated that they could potentially sequester somewhere in the region of between 0.66 and 3.3 tonnes of CO2 per hectare per year. Obviously, there are ranges. It's going to depend on the quantity and quality of the hedgerows you have, and it's going to depend on soil and climate and all of these other factors. But just to give you some kind of feel for the figures at a local scale. So in terms of hedgerow area, as I said, we're lucky we've got an extensive network of them throughout Ireland and also the UK. I've given some figures here for the estimated areas under hedgerows in Ireland. In terms of Great Britain, I would have taken the figure from the countryside survey of 700,000 kilometres of woody linear features and just assumed a width of 3 metres on that to give that estimate. I'm sure there's probably better ways of doing it, but that was just an estimate to give us a rough idea of what's in Great Britain. But if we bring it back to farm scale again, based on the surveys that I've been working on over 118 farms right throughout Ireland, we were seeing that about 2.5 hectares of average farm size was actually allocated to hedgerows and their associated margins. So that's a very substantial portion of farm area that is storing and actively sequestering carbon. Of course, the structural condition of the hedgerows is going to have an important impact. Again, looking to the countryside survey and the data that's there, it's been estimated that about 48% of the managed hedgerows are in good structural condition. That means that over half of the managed hedges aren't in good structural condition. And similar data from Ireland, from studies that I was involved in here at farm scale. So we have a significant body of work to improve the structural quality of those hedgerow networks in order that they function as both stock-proof boundaries, all of the other ecosystem services they provide, but also in terms of maximising their carbon sequestration potential. There is a point, and certainly from AXA's paper, we would have seen that it looked like wider and larger hedges were better in terms of their carbon store, as you would expect. But there comes a point within the life cycle of a hedge where a fairly large intervention is required in terms of rejuvenating that hedgerow. And we see on these that once you get to the escape type hedge, as you'll see on the left-hand side, it is time to do something like laying the hedge or coppicing the hedge in order to rejuvenate it. So if we don't do that, we're going to end up with a series of relict hedges, which of course will store the existing carbon in them for whatever time they continue to live for. And they're also important for biodiversity, but they are in the process of dying out. So we need to do something to pull hedges back before they get to that point. So really we need to find that happy medium between over-managing our hedges and also having those major interventions when we need to have them in order to keep them healthy and dense, fast-growing hedgerow networks. Another issue I just wanted to touch on, because there's been a very significant amount of talk about it in recent years, and indeed it's been recognised as one of the most important ways of sequestering carbon, potentially, is agroforestry. And that offers, I suppose, a toolbox of ways in which we can integrate forestry with agriculture to be mutually beneficial to both sectors. There's a whole range of ways this can be done, but the one I'm going to talk about just a little bit with the help of Professor Jim McAdam's slides is silvopastoral systems, where we have widely spaced trees that are grown in pasture. So you have the grassland produced for the animal grazing, but also you get a tree crop. The data I'm going to show comes from the AFBI silvopastoral system established in Loughgall in County Armagh in 1989. And this is the longest running silvipastoral system in this part of the world. It was established as part of the UK National Network experiment. So in terms of the carbon stored, this is in ash silvipastoral systems, and they also had ash woodlands in this. The carbon stored, when they looked at that, they destructively investigated it within a number of trees in their silvipastoral system, and broke it down into the various components, the twigs, the small branches, the roots, etc. They found that the total carbon in the woody biomass was over 77 tons of carbon per hectare. So this gives some idea of the potential of these systems to store carbon. Obviously, again, it depends with the species, the age of the system, the soil it's going into, the climate, etc. But this does give us some knowledge of it. In terms of the soil carbon stocks under the same, when compared in the same area at a 26-year-old silvipastoral system, we're seeing that there wasn't a significant difference between the soil carbon and between grasslands, the silvipastoral system, and indeed the woodlands. However, what was really interesting from this work was that the portion of carbon stored as very large macro aggregates was larger under the grassland systems than under the silvipastoral and woodland systems. There, the researchers found that there were a much greater amount of small and very small particle sizes, which would be more stable, I believe. It's they're locked up for longer the smaller they are, as I understand. So in terms of the sequestration potential, some of the net annual rates that are produced in the literature, just for silvipasture, for example, with ash is 2.4 tons of carbon per hectare per year, versus pasture, which would be perennial ryegrass pasture, somewhere between 0.6 and 1.2 tons per hectare, versus those fast-growing Sitka spruce plantations where we're talking about 3.8 tons per hectare. However, for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier on, I think we need to be very careful about how we balance our forestry plantation with our grasslands, and potentially our silvipastoral systems as well. I think in terms of meeting this challenge, we need to implement a range of options. We're going to have to improve our hedgerow networks. We're going to have to make sure that they are not dying out, that they are vigorously growing. We're potentially going to have to look at options like silvipastoral systems in parts. Perhaps they have the potential to aid the beleaguered dry stock farming community as well, with an additional income from those systems coming from the tree growth within them. We're working together with Devonish Nutrition at a farm in Doubt in the Republic of Ireland, together with Wageningen University and individuals like Professor Jim McAdam from AFBI and Queen's University Belfast, to actually develop a carbon neutral suckler system, if you like, stocked at 2 livestock units per hectare. And that's combining a number of these options, including the silvipastoral system, the farm woodlands, but also multi-species grasslands there. I think it's important to recognise that we're going to need a range of plant diversity included at every option that we select in order to build significant resilience into the system.
Great. Thanks very much, Helen. And I'm now going to hand, hopefully, back over to Mike to lead some Q&A. There are lots of questions in chat. We're not going to be able to go through. If you could stop sharing your screen, Helen, then that will come back up to. Yep, Mike, are you there?
I am, Maggie. Can you see me and hear me?
I can't see you, but yep.
Yeah, I
can now see you. So I'll turn off and hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Maggie, and I apologise for being in and out, but I did catch a lot of the presentations. and the discussions, and thank you everyone for adding all your questions to chat, and for our speakers for putting some answers back to those. So I've just noted down a couple which I'll pass over to the speakers first. So Andy, if I start with you, there's been a lot of discussions about soil health and the interaction with arable systems. So what do you think is the role of animal manures, not only just within grassland systems in terms of returning the carbon, but also potentially for arable systems? Is that a way that we can convert arable soils into a healthier position?
So I've always typically, so I should say to everyone, a lot of the work that I did was up at Rothensted's site in Harpenden, where a lot of the research is focused on arable, well, almost all the work is focused on arable work. And working there, I've very much got the impression that where manure is needed most is in arable systems, because there's very little carbon going into those soils. And also because grassland systems are probably close to their maximum carbon storage capacity. So putting more in is not giving us any benefit except losing a lot of that carbon to the atmosphere. Where it can really be an advantage is to put that on arable soil. And we have done some work on Broadbork, where we've got some arable treatments side by side with inorganic fertilizers in continuous wheat. And we've been able to show that, well, two things. Firstly, adding farmyard manure at an unrealistic 35 tons per hectare every year has created the sort of soil structure that we see in very nearby woodland, so that the structure, when you receive that much farmyard manure, really does look like a sort of back to nature structure. But more importantly, where the real benefits are is that the amount of nitrous oxide and methane lost from those soils that contain farmyard manure are a fraction and occur far less regularly than losses from the inorganic fertilized soils. So there's a real benefit of getting that farmyard manure into arable soils, which probably isn't going to be realized putting them on grasslands. So that's how I would answer that. You want me to carry on? He's gone again, isn't he?
You're right, he has. There, one has to be
like the Scarlet Pimpernel.
Okay, so let me just ask, there's a question, oops, there was a question. It was a question for Helen. Many larger scale Sitka plantations begin with ploughing the hill to give the trees a good start. Has any work been done on different planting regimes and their release of existing soil carbon? That's from James Pringle.
Well, I guess, I suppose what we have seen is a lot of Sitka spruce plantations going into areas that I wouldn't necessarily agree with them going into, and certainly replacing other potentially much more important carbon stores like our blanket bogs, for example. So I would have huge difficulties with that for a start, and I think we have to be hugely careful about where we site those plantations. Things have improved, but it's certainly an area that needs ongoing attention. I'm not sure if there has been work in terms of ploughing, but I would assume if you're going into permanent grassland and you're ploughing it up, you're going to have a significant release of carbon initially before you put in your Sitka spruce.
Thank you for that. That's one from Mark Jacob to everyone. Reflecting that last slide, is ash a dependable tree species to be investing in?
Well, I guess what people are looking at here in Ireland at the moment is actually sycamore and cherry as potential options in silvipastoral systems. From my perspective, I don't think we should be looking at monocultures in these systems. If we are going to go down that route, we should be trying to get diversity of species into them in order to build resilience, because as you rightly say, ash has had its problems over recent years. So, you know, we need to build in a range of species into them, I think, if we're going to have proper resilience within them.
Okay, here's a bit of controversy that John Oldham put in some time ago. Sorry, these are a bit of a random as I go through the chat. Andy began by pointing out the very slow rate of carbon sequestration in soil under grazing from long-term monitoring. Katja suggested some management options that may enhance carbon sequestration under grazing, measured, I presume, over a relatively short period of time. So the question about how fast can you actually measure? Can you see these changes in carbon sequestration? What sort of timescales are we talking about? Katja, do you want to start?
So the measurements are really slow. So if we base our measurements on soil samplings, so it takes at least 5 years, I would say, until you can find the difference. And even then it's really difficult. If you know, you have to know that the soils mostly contain, let's say 2% to 10%, which or more, which will be organic soil of carbon. So you add some more carbon to this little amount of carbon which is already there. It takes a very long time before you can say it's statistically proven that you have a carbon sequestration. And then from the literature, why there is grazing, or why there is so little carbon sequestration on grazing, I think it's also together with the heterogeneity of different papers. So grazing is not much published in Europe. It's much more published in US papers or in New Zealand papers, don't having the same ecosystems as we have, or not, at least not like in the Ireland, in the Netherlands, or in France, or in the UK. So these are rangelands, which are different vegetation cover. So this might be the reason why it's so slow. And also the initial carbon stock. So as Andy said, so there might be very high carbon amounts already in the soil. So it takes a very long time to add some more. Yes, I think I said everything.
Andy, do you want to add anything?
I would just add two things. First of all, I think I would have said 5 years too, Katja, but based on, so we've done some time series analysis of adding carbon to soil and using X-ray tomography to look at very fine scale structures. We typically don't see any changes until about 5 years, but really we see big changes, well, measurable changes, I should say, after a decade. So it's a long time. And I would also say that we need to educate legislators about this, because, you know, when they're talking about, oh, farmers should capture carbon in soil, that's a real issue if it's going to take 10 years before you can actually measure it. So we need to come up with some reasonable ways for farmers to be able to quantify what's going on.
That's an excellent introduction to next week's webinar. When we're going to be hearing from people with experience in that policy science interface. I can't see Mike coming back on. Can I just clarify with Ruth as the host, can the chat be shared with everybody?
Yes, I can save the chat as a text document and then send it to everybody afterwards. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
So quite a few people have been asking for that on the chat, so we'll try and do that. And also, do we have to finish right now, Ruth, given that lots of people still online, or what's the deal, having not been briefed on this?
No, you can stay as long as you're all awake and as long as you wish.
Well, I can assure you that I'm not going to stay quite that long, however. Okay, so it's another question here from Emily Grant. If trees are harvested and then highly processed or burned, do we have to allow for that carbon loss at harvest? Surely hedgerows and grasslands are better long-term store of carbon. Helen, there's a question for you. Trees, hedgerows, grassland.
We do have to account for that carbon loss. Absolutely. I guess what we want to see is quality timber produced that will be put into long-term products would be my preference. I guess, some of the information that comes back on the silvipastoral systems is that really, you know, they're grassland farmers with trees on their farms, so they're not necessarily managing the trees particularly well for the quality of the tree. But I think that could be improved upon, and that we could potentially overcome it then to produce quality product, long-term products, that we're not just producing timber for burning. But yeah, I mean, that's what needs to happen.
Okay, thanks for that. And just to say, there's quite a lot of questions and comments in the chat, so I would recommend people to read what some of that is afterwards. A question from Andrew to Andy. If heavily manured soil comes to approximate pristine woodland soil, how does long-term grassland compare? How close can long-term grazing come to a pristine soil, i.e. before human management? Is there such thing as a pristine soil?
Well, I haven't looked at one. And I should say that when I mentioned the woodlands, it was actually part of the Rothamsted experiment that was abandoned. So I wouldn't call it natural. It is a sort of a back to nature management approach, where the structure that's there, or the structure that's generated when you throw loads of farmyard manure in, approaches that sort of back to nature woodland. So if you abandon soil or planted specific trees there, then you would generate a good structure. As far as long-term grassland is concerned, the structure looks very similar to the woodland. At the micro scale, I should say, the structures look very similar. I haven't yet looked at soil that's been grazed for a long period. So that's one of the reasons for me moving down to North Wick and getting involved with the farm platform there, is to start answering some of those questions in long-term grazed soils. So I can't completely answer that question, I'm afraid.
So the question was if you change the soil structure over time, and if you can improve the soil structure by grazing. This is what you mean with brisk? I don't know the word. Yes?
Me? To me, Katja?
Yeah, or the question which was read by Maggie. What means the word brisk?
I've moved on from it, sorry. I'm not going to be able to.
Means sort of
pristine.
I think you can change the soil structure because it's not, so the plants change, the roots change the structure, then there are the macro and microfauna. So there are the engineers, how they call it. So there are the worms. And I know, and you can, there are, but it's not here, it's more in the northern countries. They sort of plow over or deep plow over the soil to change the structure, as they found out that they can't enter more carbon, not carbon anymore. So they have this sort of deep, very deep plowing, more than 1 meter. Maybe Andy knows about this experiments in Sweden, which seemed to work very well, which was a bit strange to me at the beginning, but yeah, it's not what we would do here in France, but yeah.
So someone's, Alec Moore is asking, once carbon saturation reached, does soil depth start to increase? Are we losing soil in the UK? I mean, that brings in other things like erosion.
That, but save me the effort. My understanding is that once soil is saturated, any additional organic carbon that you're adding to that soil is probably respired, and so you're just adding to the loss of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And at some point, I hope we'll be able to be very clever about how we manipulate carbon, and once soils are saturated, move our addition of carbon onto other soils that need it more, and sort of manage soils by, over long periods of time, topping up the carbon, letting it run down a little and topping it back up. My concern is if we just pile more and more carbon onto soil, eventually, once saturation's reached, a lot of that is just going to be adding to the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's not a simple process. And As far as carbon losses, I think we are, but a lot of it is due to runoff. Certainly when I drive around Devon, there's soil running down the hills all the time.
Don't you think that carbon is built up?
Sorry?
I'm not sure if I agree with your answer.
That's
because
fine.
there have a number of questions on that. What if you can saturate the soil and if you have a buildup, meaning a real buildup in the horizons? I believe you can either enter the carbon into the deep soil or have a real buildup, means it gets higher and higher. Because if you go back to the prehistoric, if they have to dig quite often very deep to find the bones and all the pottery. So which means there was some parts were erosion, I agree with you, but some parts I also think that the carbon was built up over time and that the soil got higher and higher.
Okay, so questions, comments are still coming in, and Claire Thomas makes a very relevant one, again relevant for the link between this webinar and the one next week, which is about research grants need to be longer if you're actually going to make some of these measurements. And indeed, the point also is if you're actually going to pay based on, if payments are going to be made to farmers based on carbon sequestration, you know, how's that actually going to happen, given that it's a very slow process. Wow, these questions coming in thick and fast. Would you see carbon sequestration as a climate change mitigation strategy, or is it better accounted for as soil health? Which is an interesting question. Andy, as a microbiologist.
Well, so other researchers at Rothamsted have shown that the capacity for the 4 per mil targets, although it is possible, getting there often would require farmers to use financially unacceptable practices for them, or practically unacceptable practices. And, you know, as we've been discussing, a lot of soils are already saturated, so the capacity to store is not as great everywhere. My own personal preference is that getting carbon into soil is more about the resilience of soil to store water and to use nutrients efficiently. I think that's the greater benefit, but because it's more complicated to explain, I don't think we're getting that message across very well. But so that, I mean, Katia, perhaps you think differently, but that's my own personal view as a microbiologist.
Oh, she's showing she agrees with you there in the typical Zoom response to say for unmuting and everything else. Yeah, and that whole question about diversity and are soils saturated, etc., also brings back to the importance of the soil maps that exist, where there's already maps of the carbon content of soils, I think across the whole of Europe. Is that right? Yeah. So, but certainly having worked at the Hutton, I was very aware of what there was for Scotland. And then it is, yeah, no soil, it's like diversity, it's everything is slightly different, and therefore the ability still to capture carbon must be different between different ones. Right, I think I do need to bring this to a close. I keep looking to check whether Michael, are you actually joined us again or not? No, looks as if he isn't. Annie, just let me check these.
He's not on the delegates list.
It's not on, no. Right, so various people are saying that supper's ready, children have arrived home, various other things. Thanks very much to everyone for participating in this. Helen's having to leave us, so thanks very much to the speakers. Thanks to Helen, thanks to Andy, thanks to Katja, thanks to Michael for putting this together. And thanks to BSAS and colleagues for doing all the logistics in terms of this. And I'm sure Michael is totally gutted that he hasn't been able to actually participate in this. But people are asking, will the presentations be available online? Yes, we'll let you know what's happening about that. Keep watching the BSAS page on this webinar, and you'll see what's available. So you will see both that you'll be able to get access to the talks, to a recording of this, to references, and presumably the speakers are happy for their emails to be shared.
Yes, I'm happy. And there are lots of questions I haven't been able to answer because I can't type fast enough. So if people want to email me those, I'm very happy to get back to them. There
you are. There's an offer not to refuse. So thanks very much. Most webinars I've participated in, I've had some sort of technical problem, but I hadn't quite prepared myself for the fact that this was going to happen right now. Anyway, I am supposed to be convening the one next week, although I could, of course, pass that to Michael as a sort of reciprocation, but no, I would do that. So the speakers, I think, for that are up on the website, and it would be great if we can have scientists at that as well to have the debate, because to turn all this science into evidence and into change on the ground, we need that interface strengthened between science and policy. So the more discussions we have like this, the better. So thanks very much, everyone.